Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jordan Hermany, and I'm one of MLive's two legislative reporters. I will also be your host today for our rundown of the August 2 primary elections. We've got a lot on the ballot next week. The gubernatorial race, specifically among the Republicans. We have House and Senate races. We have congressional races. And there is a lot to know and a little time to know it in, but luckily we have two of our own political team here to help walk us through it all. Like I said, my name is Jordan Hermany. I'm one of the two legislative reporters, and with me I have Simon and Ben, if you guys want to take a second just to say a little something about yourselves.
Hi, my name is Simon Schuster. I'm the senior political reporter here on the team and primarily focusing on the gubernatorial election.
And my name is Ben Orner. I'm a political reporter on the team. I cover Secretary of State, Attorney General, elections, voting, and whatever else they throw at me.
And whatever else is quite a broad topic, but that pretty much sums up what the ballot is going to be looking like next week. So I guess we can just start straight from the top with one of the biggest races, I would say, Simon, if that is, the correct term of August. We have the Republican gubernatorial primary election. And I was wondering if you could take us through for just a second the five candidates who are still in the running and who they are and what they sort of stand for.
Yeah, so I mean, we are, 1 week out from the election, and this primary is still something that's relatively undecided. There's not, like in a lot of other races, a clear front runner where things are basically wrapped up and a bunch of people trailing in the dust. This is really a race where a lot can happen in the upcoming days. I suppose I could start, clockwise here from top center with Tudor Dixon, who, polling shows that this is still a relatively undecided race, but she is considered to be sort of someone who has some of the most potential to come away with a victory here. She's from Norton Shores and was most recently a news personality on the conservative news network Real America's Voice. And she's worked for her father's steel company and has sort of been slowly becoming more and more involved in conservative circles over the past 4 or 5 years. As a candidate, she's leaned in hard on sort of the culture wars and talked about education and school choice quite a bit. And so this and sort of her polish as a candidate has enabled her to win over Michigan's sort of conservative donor class. And so she's racked up a slew of endorsements from senior Republican elected officials. And then, of course, the competition in this race, who is running relatively outside tracks, more populist and grassroots-oriented campaigns, have used this as a line of attack against her. But as a result, she's been able to bring significant financial resources to bear and spend quite a bit of money. But that still pales in comparison to our next candidate, who's Kevin Rinke. He is a businessman from Bloomfield Hills. He grew up in and then owned and expanded a chain of auto dealerships throughout the Metro Detroit. And he has considerable wealth that he's brought to bear in the race. He's invested $10 million of his own money in this election. And he's running sort of as a conservative outsider, a businessman who's not like beholden to anybody, considering his self-financing. If this sounds a little bit like perhaps, Michigan's last Republican governor, Rick Snyder, I'd say that they're pretty different when it comes to policy. His sort of most prominent policy proposal that has earned the most attention is that he says he wants to immediately eliminate Michigan's 4.25% income tax. This is a major chunk of the budget, and his opponents are attacking him, saying, I don't know how this is possible. But he is sort of, I would say, the most fiscally conservative, but has stanced himself a little bit away on some of these social conservative issues that really his opponents have pushed hard to the right on. I'd say someone who's taken more of a populist tack, though, is Garrett Saldano. He's a chiropractor from Mattawan who sort of has his origins in a solidly grassroots framing. He started the Facebook group of Michiganders against excessive quarantine, which grew to hundreds of thousands of members in a little over a month. And then he was sort of a leader of some of these protests and the organizations that followed in its wake. And so he's sort of had to carry that momentum and this devoted core of followers forward. So he's not raising and doesn't have this millions of dollars to bear. He's raised about $2 million. But running the populist lane, he's really sort of dependent on these volunteers to really sort of go to bat for him, knock doors and answer phones in the hopes that he can, have this swelling of grassroots support that will carry him to victory, even though he may not be constantly on the television as some of his opponents are. I think another candidate in a similar lane here, and the most recognizable in the race, according to recent polling, is Ryan Kelly. He also had his roots in the resistance to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's public health emergency orders for the COVID-19 pandemic, but he sort of took a more fringe tack. He helped organize a group called the American Patriot Council, which was, it seems like, had some attention from authorities. And participated in, some of the more, I guess you could say, unsavory events, including the attack on the U.S. Capitol, January 6, 2021. He sort of exploded to prominence in this race when on June 9th, he was arrested for his involvement in that by the FBI at his home. And, this sort of immediately helped him surge to national prominence. He fundraised a pretty decent amount of money off of this. And as a result, was sort of hoped that this could, help him ride to the front of the pack in this gubernatorial election. But the money, at least, hasn't necessarily followed him with this fame. The fifth candidate now is Ralph Erdant. He's a pastor from Farmington Hills, and he's sort of like the workman in this election. He's worked skilled trades and on factory lines and as a janitor, and then it led the Oakland Hills Community Church, sort of an offshoot of the evangelical movement, for 35 years. And he's certainly the most socially conservative candidate in this race. He believes in abortion abortion should be prohibited without any exceptions, even to save the life of the mother, and has really focused on sort of cultural and social issues as the center of his campaign, while sort of glossing over the more nuts and bolts financial aspects to becoming governor.
So you keep bringing up money, which is obviously very important when you're running a campaign. And you yourself being a campaign finance guy, I was wondering if you could hit a little bit on, campaign finance for these 5 candidates. Who are we seeing bringing in the most money? And I suppose traditionally, when we do see campaigns bringing in lots of money, people want to automatically assume, well, you're the front runner. I mean, can we make that same sort of comparison here?
Right. And that's a really good question. I think in part because since 2016, polling gives us an indication of where the public is heading, but especially among Republican voters, it's become less predictive of how the votes actually turn out. I think in large part because they're getting low response rates from people who are considered grassroots conservatives, people who are more distrustful of establishment institutions, but are still engaged voters, are not responding to these polls. So I think as a result, it's not necessarily the end all be all to seeing who's winning. While Kevin Rinke has devoted $10 million of his personal wealth and spent at least half of that on broadcast advertising, that's certainly a sign. And that's because in primary elections, the conventional wisdom among political consultants is that the more people who know your name and what you're about and your message, the better you're going to do, especially in a race with multiple candidates such as this. That said, Garrett Saldano, it definitely appears to be the candidate with the most engaged sort of volunteer base. He has a lot of volunteers working for him and a lot of people that want to sort of get signs and get involved with his campaign. And so this could be sort of an aspirational sign for him. Tudor Dixon as well has an appeal to sort of more conventional Republicans in that she's racking up these endorsement supports. The Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey is backing her campaign, as is former Republican Governor John Engler. And so having these endorsements in your pocket can be really valuable. Her campaign, though, technically hasn't raised all that much money. I believe it's only raised about $1.6 million in total off the top of my head. But this is where sort of some of her establishment support, especially among deep-pocketed donors, has really benefited her. She has a super PAC. She doesn't have a super PAC, but there is a super PAC, Michigan Families United, that has spent far more than her campaign, about 20 times more, in fact, running ads on her behalf. And so these can't coordinate with one another, but she's obviously featured prominently in the ads, and they're really, sort of pushing her up to election day. So this is an additional factor. For Ryan Kelly and Ralph Erdant, there's far less money in the picture. And unfortunately, Mr. Erdant has been polling at just between 1% and 2% in this election.
So you bring up endorsements, and he's a name that's been on a lot of people's minds. I wrote a story about endorsements from him yesterday. Former President Donald Trump his voice has been noticeably absent from this gubernatorial primary. And I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Garrett Saldano who explicitly even made a plea, Mr. President, please don't actually weigh in yet, don't give your endorsement yet. Is there a reason why Trump is yet to endorse? And I guess what's sort of the logic behind his reasoning?
Right. So what I've heard from multiple sources is that, he would like to endorse, but that there's sort of, he has met, in his resort in Mar-a-Lago has different aides coming to him and sort of pulling him in different directions. And that there's not really a clear direction which everyone thinks would be most efficient for him to move in. And that's because these candidates sort of occupy the lanes, at least the three that are sort of most in line for his endorsement, which are said to be Tudor Dixon, Kevin Rinke, and Garrett Saldano. They occupy really the distinct lanes that were the source of tension within his White House. Garrett Saldano is very much sort of the populist, people's candidate for those that support him, whereas Tudor Dixon is sort of, enmeshed in the traditional power structure and power brokers of Republican politics. And Kevin Rinke is sort of a wealthy guy from the outside that probably can speak to Trump's own predilections of like what he likes in a candidate, which is himself. And so as a result, people are moving in different directions. And like any good rom-com, we are just sort of sitting here with bated breath wondering, will he or won't he?
That's a pretty apt description for it. And just an aside for the individuals watching on our Facebook page, if you do leave a question, we do have a social media moderator who is looking at those, and we will try and get to those as we can. Feel free to chime in, and we will do our best to answer if you guys have any questions. But sort of staying on that same Trump question, I'm going to pivot to Ben for a moment so we can talk about Congress. Trump has weighed in certain congressional races, hasn't he? And there are a number of, all the congressional districts are on the ballot this year, but there's a couple that we're specifically interested in, and one in particular that Trump has already weighed in on.
Yeah, really the big one we're watching is the 3rd Congressional District, which is the Grand Rapids area. And that's Peter Meijer, the incumbent there on the left, and then John Gibbs, who is the Trump Endorse candidate. So if you remember back to 2021, Peter Meijer, just a week or so into office, he experiences what it was like to be inside the Capitol building during the January 6th attack. He feels that President Trump had some responsibility there. So he voted to impeach the president on January 6th related counts. And the former president has held that against him ever since. Peter Meijer was only one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump then. And so that gives John Gibbs, a lot of kindling to run a campaign. John Gibbs, he is from the Lansing area, just recently moved to the Grand Rapids area. He worked under Secretary Ben Carson in the Housing and Urban Development Department. He doesn't really have housing experience before that. He was really he had a software background. He's a well-educated guy, has 2 degrees. But the way he's running his campaign is he's banking on grassroots support, and he's banking on the Trump endorsement. I spent some time with John Gibbs on the campaign trail, and that's really what he's hammering home. He got the Trump endorsement less than a week after he announced last fall, and he's trying to paint Peter Meijer as this anti-Trump Republican, a Republican in name only, and he's trying to come at him from the right. A problem with that is redistricting. Every district in America was redrawn after the 2020 census, and Michigan's 3rd district around Grand Rapids was when Peter Meijer was elected in 2020, the Republican swing was a 5 or 6 point advantage. And now, after redistricting, it's a 1 point advantage for Democrats. So if John Gibbs was running against Peter Meijer, trying to primary him on the Republican side in a very Republican-heavy district, he'd probably have a lot better chance. We've seen the Trump endorsement work really well in states like Ohio or North Carolina. Those are solidly conservative states. But Trump's endorsement hasn't worked that well in more purple states like Georgia. So if a Republican voter is going to the ballot box on August 2nd and thinking all right, I don't know if maybe I agree with both of these guys on a lot of things, but who can beat the Democrat in November? that person would probably pick Peter Meyer because it's not that he's less conservative, he's just less Trumpy. He would appeal more to people who are toward the right of center, like toward the center. So that's going to be a challenge to John Gibbs. We don't really know who's going to win this thing. The only polling was done in January, the only independent kind of reputable kind of poll, and that showed Meyer with a decent lead. But an interesting part of that poll was the pollster then asked people, they then informed them that Gibbs has Trump's endorsement and Meyer voted to impeach Trump. And after voters were informed of the Trump factor in that primary, the poll results actually flipped to supporting Gibbs. So political experts that I've talked to, they have no idea who's going to win this thing. I wish we had more polling, but this is probably going to be the highest profile race that we watch.
And it's not only the Republicans who are seeing a tough primary. There are candidates on the Democratic side too, Simon. There is a race that you were in touch with a little while ago in the 11th Congressional District between Haley Stevens and Andy Levin. And I was wondering if you could kind of dig into what's sort of going on there. I mean, these are two high-profile incumbent candidates who, instead of saying, hey, I'll move to one district and you can move to another, both of them are saying, no, this is my turf.
Yeah, this is a really interesting primary, especially when so much of the 2022 elections has been about the staying power of Democrats broadly. This is a primary among, Democrats who came into the House and were relatively prominent and can raise a decent amount of money. And so, and we're, initially very collegial and cordial, but has grown increasingly acrimonious. And so what we've seen here is rather than, saying who can be more conservative, where it's become sort of a purity test towards progressivism. And so Andy Levin has he's aligned himself in Congress with, the squad being Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others. And he sort of said, I am sort of an all of the above progressive. You talk about the Green New Deal, expanding the Supreme Court, all of these different factors, I'm for it. And these are the things where, he can hit a home run, and Haley Stevens is not willing to go that far. Meanwhile, she's sort of positioning herself as a more pragmatic liberal, someone who's very liberal, even progressive, but is, while she won't vote for single-payer health care, she's going to note that Congress hasn't even held a vote on, sort of establishing a single-payer healthcare system because, to be frank, there's not the support for that. And so where she's focused is sort of the economic issues. And she really wants to hammer home that she is interested in, these issues that are kitchen table, like inflation and bringing back jobs and pork to the district. And this is where she's had considerable success, and also where she's been able to raise more money. Because Levin has taken this pledge to not accept corporate PAC dollars, whereas Stevens has taken some. And most importantly, Andy Levin is Jewish. Haley Stevens is not. However, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee is an organization with an enormous amount of influence in Washington, representing Israel's support, and they do not tolerate criticism of that nation's government. And Levin has come out, criticizing some of the policies of that government. Although he's a very vocal supporter of Israel as a country itself, he's been also critical of their treatment of the Palestinian people. And so as a result, they're off AIPAC's. He's been off AIPAC's reservation, and instead they are heavily funding Haley Stevens through the use or ads supporting her, I should say, and fundraising directly into her campaign account as well. It's to the tune of several $1 million, more than $3 million, in fact, and are running ads that from a super PAC called United Democracy Project that don't touch on their issue, but instead are just generally supportive of Stevens. And so this is really sort of the headwinds that Levin has been battling against. She's had a lot more support on the airtime, and there's been a lot more spending in her favor. Whereas Levin, he's sort of, as an 11th hour move, is starting to bring in some progressive heavyweights. U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren has come in to stump for him, and then I believe he's also receiving support from U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. So he's hoping that he can sort of have this groundswell of support when he's losing on the money game, whereas Stevens has sort of considerable financial resources behind her. All in all, though, ideologically speaking, these candidates are very similar. The things that differentiate them most substantively on policy, most of them have not come up for a vote in Congress because they will not have the votes to pass with the Democrats, razor thin margins. So it's an interesting position because these candidates are very similar on policy. They vote together 97% of the time in Congress, but yet this whole campaign has been about creating distance and differentiation between them.
So briefly, is this similar to Myers-Gibbs, where, we will find out who is the candidate to beat on election night, or is there a clear sense of a front runner here?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity, but given the amount of advertising that Stevens has behind her, I think that would establish her as the favorite in this race, especially considering how there's new chunks of a reform district. What's important here, and I think an important sort of narrative in redistricting overall, which I know we'll be talking about in a moment, is that this district, the new 11th, absorbs parts of the old 14th district, which was represented by Brenda Lawrence, a Black congresswoman who represented the large Black communities within Oak Park and Pontiac. So both of these candidates have spent considerable time in these communities courting the votes of these residents, who now are basically staring down the face of no longer having minority representation in Congress that has the same race as these constituencies. And so I think that's going to be a pretty deciding factor in this election if there's significant turnout within these municipalities.
And so, I mean, we're also seeing Democratic candidates in the 12th and in the 13th. So in the 12th is Rashida Tlaib is running for re-election. She's facing off against Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey. There's also Chanel Jackson and Kelly Garrett are two other Democratic candidates. But by and large, in terms of politicos that I've spoken to, seems to really be a race there of name recognition, in which it's believed that Tlaib and Winfrey do have the highest amount of name recognition. Again, Winfrey for being the Detroit City Clerk, and Rashida Tlaib for being a member of the Squad and already a sitting Congresswoman. So there might not be as much of a nail biter as we're expecting in the Stevens-Levins race. She fundraised above all of her other opponents. In most of the polls, it's acknowledged that she is likely to win re-election, and in that kind of district, given the Democrat makeup of it, if she wins the primary, it is very likely that she will go on to win the general. But where it's a little less clear is in the 13th Congressional District, where we have a just slew of candidates running. I believe there's 9 total, 3 of which are considered to be the front runners, quote unquote. From left to right here, we have current sitting House Democratic Rep Sri Thanadar. If that name is familiar to you, it's because he ran for governor several years ago, but did lose to Gretchen Whitmer in the primary. In the middle, we have Focus Hope CEO and head of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, Portia Roberson. And then on the far right, we have Senator Adam Ollier. And these 3 are considered to be the top contenders. But again, we're looking at this being an entirely new district due to redistricting. So how this is going to play out for these candidates, we really don't have that good of an idea. Sri Thanadar does have millions of dollars to his name, but most of his campaign is completely self-fundraised. If we want to talk in terms of fundraising, Ollier is the front runner in that regard, considering actual donations received. But he and Roberson have also received a number of nods from different organizations in terms of wanting them to be the candidate to beat. So there's a lot of moving parts at play. And just quickly, while we have about 5 minutes left in this video rundown, the biggest thing that candidates and voters and everybody need to know about, frankly, is how much of a play that redistricting has on all of these races. So, Simon, I was wondering if you could get into a little bit the fact that, we have new maps now. We are one of the few states where, yes, while our maps were challenged, we're going into this primary with the maps that our redistricting commission did decide. And these maps do put the state in play a little bit more than years prior, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that while there's sort of a lot of unanswered questions in regard to the state legislature, in Congress, some sort of clear dynamics have emerged. It's important to note that the amount of seats that were apportioned in Congress has changed because while other states have grown over the past 10 years in population, Michigan grew a little tiny bit, but not very much. And so as a result, we're down from 14 congressional seats to 13. We lost the 14th district, which had previously been occupied by Brenda Lawrence. And so she had opted, rather than instead of trying to run over the way in which her old district had been split up, which was heavily gerrymandered throughout Metro Detroit, she instead opted to retire. And so as a result, we are looking at, I think the most prominent issue within the congressional maps is that while, as Ben noted, the 3rd district has moved more to the, has a little bit more of a blue tint to it than it did in the past, that there is sort of differing African-American representation, and the amount of African-American representation in Congress is facing the possibility of decreasing. And then depending upon the outcome of the 13th district primary, there actually could be no Black members of Michigan's congressional delegation. And this has, community members pretty concerned. Treat Thanadar is someone who sort of, his backstory is the epitome of the American dream in many respects. He was an immigrant from India who, spent his time in college earning an advanced degree, living in the trunk of his car for part of that time, and then it became a multi-million-dollar business owner. And so he's able to invest millions of his own dollars into this race. But the fact of the matter remains, while a person of color, he's of Indian background, whereas a lot of these other prominent candidates in the 13th are African American. And so as a result, this has sort of taken on a subtext, I think, a little bit in this race as things have become more competitive and a little bit more rancorous. And so I think that that's sort of something that's on the front of a lot of people's minds, both in the congressional level, Black representation broadly, both at the congressional level and when it comes to the state legislature. I think that there's a lot remains to be seen in the state legislature and those competitiveness. I don't know. Do you have perspective on that, Jordan?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we got in fundraising totals yesterday from the House and Senate Republicans and Democrats, just sort of how they're doing with fundraising. And if we're looking at it for the first time, I believe in a number of years, the Senate Democrats have out fundraised the Senate Republicans. It is a matter of question how much of that does benefit from Senator Mallory McMorrow out of Royal Oak. She gained national attention following a comment from a Republican colleague in a fundraising email accusing her of promoting grooming. And as a result, McMorrow's pushback on that did go viral, and she did raise something like $1 million in this last fundraising quarter. We also see that the House Democrats have also fundraised more than the House Republicans, but the big caveat is in both cases, both the House and Senate Republicans are entering into the primary and the general election with far more cash on hand than their Democratic counterparts, which does give them a very big leg up to start mounting a campaign and really pushing their candidates and advertising, mailing, TV advertising, things like that. Mm-hmm. So again, I mean, we are seeing some momentum on the ground there, but there's a lot of moving parts here that I believe a decent chunk can be chalked up to redistricting. But briefly, before we do end our half hour here, Ben, I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview regarding entering into the primary election next week. Where are we at with absentee ballots, if you have that sort of information, and are we expecting sort of a similar AV turnout to the last election?
Yeah, so the highlight is basically this is the first election. Well, so in 2018, Michiganders passed you didn't have to have an excuse to vote absentee.
No reason absentee.
Yeah, no reason absentee. In 2020, it was kind of a special circumstance. People voted absentee because of the pandemic. But now that that's kind of died down, 2022 is like kind of the first test of like, all right, who's going to vote absentee when they want to? Because you actually have to request it. It's not just like an application isn't just sent to you. It's about double that it was in 2018. So folks are really taking advantage of absentee ballots, but they're being returned at a lower rate than they were for the 2018 primary. So whether that's like a voter apathy kind of thing, folks just aren't engaged. I guess that's probably the prevailing opinion. But primaries also don't get a lot of voter turnout anyway. it's only around like 20% that people vote in a primary, because it's the general election that like really drives turnout when you get like over half. And it's also a midterm year, so there will be no president on the ballot in November anyway. So I think but those are the highlights.
And so I guess just one last question then in that regard. Obviously, contesting election results was a major focus of the 2020 election. How likely do you think we are to see that happen again?
It's hard to say. A lot of these candidates are really on the Republican side, frankly. They've built their campaigns around doubting the legitimacy of the 2020 election. The 2020 election was secure. There was no widespread voter fraud, just to get that out there. But candidates continue to say that there was a lot of voter fraud. There wasn't. It'll be interesting to see, especially I think of the governor primary, where you'll have one winner and four losers, and will the losers say, well, there was fraud, I lost because of fraud? Ryan Kelly comes to mind, the guy on the top left, just because he's really talked about voter fraud a lot, even though they all have kind of touched on it. So will the four candidates challenge? The four losers can challenge and say, I didn't lose because I legitimately lost. I lost because of voter fraud. And then also, if the winner is a candidate who has had a history of doubting the legitimacy of the 2020 election, when they win, will they say, oh yeah, that was a safe election, there was no fraud? So it's going to be something that we watch on primary night and then through the end of the year, especially as President Donald Trump is still a big player in American politics. These claims of a stolen election and people harping on election fraud, this is just going to continue.
Yeah, and I think that's one of many X factors here, and I think it's important to note for our viewers, no matter however many there are, that you can only vote in the primary for one party at a time. If you are selecting races, you can only vote in Republican primaries or Democratic primaries. So you have to pick one party. And so as a result, there are no contested Democratic race. There is no contested Democratic race at the top of the ticket. The governor is already decided as the incumbent Gretchen Whitmer. And so with these sort of gubernatorial elections and the Republican gubernatorial primary taking top billing, I think it's really going to be interesting to see if to any extent, and to what extent that might be, whether Democratic crossover voters who are deciding to instead vote in the Republican primary can, perhaps place their thumb on the outcome, and whether they decide like who to vote for if they're voting strategically, whether they want to vote for the candidate who is most palatable or least electable is always something where I think you'll see some splitting in these Democratic voters, but it will be interesting to see, if that has any demonstrable effect.
And I feel like that is a great place to put a pin in it. Thank you, Simon, because that was going to be a portion of what I was going to touch on in our outro here. But this kind of wraps up what we have for you regarding a August 2 primary rundown. Again, the election is next Tuesday, and we will be covering it for MLive, so you can follow along on our Twitters or Facebook. At this rate, I know Ben mentioned absentee ballots. The Secretary of State is encouraging those be returned physically and not by mail if you want them to count in time for the election. And just thank you very much for tuning in with us. And we're looking forward to the primary.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.